July 1944, West Texas. The sun was already cruel by dawn when the truck rolled through the gate of the holding site near Abilene, carrying a dozen Japanese women who had not spoken above whispers for days. They had crossed an ocean in silence, marched through camps in California, and now found themselves delivered to a place no map in their country had ever shown, a stretch of fenced earth beside a cattle ranch where the wind sounded like a furnace. The guards did not shout. That was the first thing that unnerved them. No orders, no barked insults, just the quiet scrape of boots and the metallic click of the gate closing behind them. For the women, mostly Red Cross nurses and stranded civilians evacuated from Saipan, this silence felt dangerous. Every other camp they'd passed through had taught them that stillness came before cruelty. They stood straight, waiting for humiliation, for the blow that never came. A sergeant checked his clipboard and waved to a man leaning against a fence, not a soldier, not even an officer. His shirt was open at the collar, sleeves rolled, hat tilted to block the light. A cowboy, they would later learn. But at that moment he was just another kind of captor. They were ordered out, not harshly, but firmly. Dust rose around their ankles as they formed a line. The cowboy didn't look at them the way the soldiers had, his gaze was assessing, almost puzzled. The sergeant handed him a list, pointed toward the barn, then left without another word. When the truck pulled away, the women realized they were not inside a prison compound. They were beside a ranch wide, loud, alive. The cows mooed somewhere beyond the windbreak. The smell of hay and leather filled the air. A woman named Aiko, once a nurse in Yokohama, counted the others under her breath. 11. All thin, all frightened. She whispered a prayer of endurance. She had seen American bombers, she had bandaged the wounds they left. Now she was in their country, standing before a man whose only weapon seemed to be a rope looped over his arm. He spoke to another cowboy, voice low, then motioned for the women to follow. They hesitated, and the translator, a Nisei soldier from California, called out in Japanese, "They need help on the ranch. You'll work here. No harm will come." The words made no sense. Prisoners helping their enemies? Work on horses, not chains? Aiko's stomach tightened. The women obeyed, their steps slow, wary. They were led to a wooden building, barracks from another era, swept clean but spare. Inside were bunks with sheets, a small stove, and a pitcher of water. On the table sat a tin plate of cornbread, still warm. It might have been poison for all they knew. None touched it until one younger girl, desperate with hunger, tore off a corner and tasted it. She nodded silently. Then they all ate. By evening, the cowboy returned, carrying 2 saddles. Through the translator he said the ranch needed more hands for the harvest work, feeding, hauling supplies, managing horses. The women looked at one another in disbelief. They were nurses, teachers, wives of merchants, not laborers. Aiko protested softly, but he only smiled, as though amused by the idea that someone couldn't learn to ride. That smile stirred anger. It felt like mockery. Yet when he placed one saddle on the fence and began to show how it worked, the straps, the stirrups, the motion of tightening, his movements were patient, deliberate, even gentle. One of the women muttered that this must be a test, a trick to humiliate them before the guards laughed. But there were no guards. Only the open field, the sound of distant cattle, and a sky without fences. The next morning the lesson began. 2 Mustangs were brought forward, restless and unbroken. The cowboy pointed to them and said something the translator softened, "They'll help you carry feed. But first you must learn to trust them." Trust was not a word the women associated with enemies. Aiko refused at first, saying she was a nurse, not a rider. The cowboy shrugged and motioned to another, Sachiko, younger, braver, too tired to argue. When the horse shifted beneath her weight, she gasped, clutching the horn of the saddle. The animal snorted, impatient. A cowboy steadied the reins and walked beside her as she circled the corral. Each step kicked up red dust. The others watched, expecting her to fall. Instead, after a few tense minutes, her posture straightened, her grip loosened. The horse slowed, then stopped on its own. The cowboy tipped his hat. The watching women said nothing, but something in their silence had changed. Suspicion gave way to bewilderment. By midday 2 more had mounted. The translator told them it was only for training, not punishment. But none could understand why they were being treated as students, not slaves. When one fell, the cowboy knelt beside her, brushed off the dust, and helped her stand. No anger, no shouting. Only a quiet nod, a simple word, "Again." That night, lying on bunks they hadn't expected to have, the women listened to the strange noises outside, horses stamping, men laughing faintly near the barn, a harmonica whining through the dark. Aiko thought of the propaganda leaflets she had once believed, that American men were cruel, uncultured, obsessed with dominance. Yet these men worked with their hands, spoke softly, and treated animals with more patience than officers had ever shown their own soldiers. Sleep came slowly. Every creak of the barracks reminded them that they were still captives. But the air smelled of grass, not fear. The distance between captor and captive was measured now not in barbed wire, but in understanding too new to name. The next day, as the sun climbed high, the cowboy returned with the same calm face. He pointed to the horses again and said something through the translator that made the women laugh in disbelief. "You ride better than you think." Aiko didn't laugh. She looked at the horizon instead, a line of gold above the dust, and wondered what kind of enemy gave freedom as an assignment. They had expected chains. They received reins. And as the Mustangs tossed their heads in the morning wind, something inside the women, that hard, silent resolve to survive and hate, began to shift. But they didn't know it yet. This was only the beginning. August 1944, Abilene Sector, Texas. The heat no longer frightened them, but the silence did. Work had become rhythm, rising with the first horn, feeding, hauling, brushing down the restless Mustangs, yet Aiko still woke every morning expecting an order barked from behind, a command meant to remind her of her captivity. None came. The cowboys spoke through gesture more than words, treating them less like prisoners and more like rookies who simply needed to keep up. That contradiction, freedom inside confinement, was the part none of them could explain. By now, the camp ran like a small, strange factory of peace. The Japanese women, once strangers to soil or saddle, managed feed runs across the ranch under the lazy supervision of men who carried rope instead of rifles. The guards only checked in once a week. Most days, it was cowboys who gave instructions, and their rules were simple: do the work, respect the animals, don't get hurt. Aiko had learned to braid rope, to carry feed without spilling, to whistle for the horses. She never imagined a whistle could replace fear. The Red Cross inspector who visited that week took notes quietly, surprised by what he saw: women prisoners allowed to roam the open fields, eat side by side with Americans, and handle government livestock. He said little, but the cowboy called Hank grinned afterward. "Guess we passed inspection." The women didn't know what that meant, but they felt it, the lightness in his tone, the sense of trust growing without permission. That night, while the others slept, Aiko sat outside the barracks, watching lightning crawl along the far horizon. She had learned that these men didn't measure respect through words but through endurance. When she fell from a horse, they didn't pity her. They made her get back on. When she refused to eat, they left food by her cot, never forcing, never coaxing. It confused her more than cruelty ever could. She wondered what kind of country believed strength could be gentle. 2 weeks later, their work changed. The army sent new supplies, feed barrels too heavy to move by hand. The cowboys hitched the Mustangs to wagons and motioned for the women to help. Aiko rode at the front with Hank, learning how to guide a team through narrow fences. The wind tore at her hair, and for a brief second, she forgot who she was. The camp fence fell behind them, and only the land remained, endless, indifferent, free. Sachiko laughed when they stopped to rest. "If my father could see me now," she said in Japanese, "he would think I'd gone mad." Aiko smiled faintly. "He would think we've been captured by farmers." "Farmers who ride like gods," Sachiko answered. Each day blurred into the next. Work, food, exhaustion. But within that monotony, something sacred grew, routine as redemption. The cowboys began teaching more: how to tie knots, patch saddles, measure feed. They were rough in manner but fair in spirit. When a woman made a mistake, no one shouted. When one succeeded, someone always tipped a hat. The Americans were curious too. During water breaks, they'd ask through the translator about Japan, its mountains, its food, its cities now lost to war. The women answered carefully, ashamed to admit how little they knew of their own country beyond duty and obedience. In those exchanges, an invisible mirror formed. both sides seeing the other's humanity, both startled by how ordinary it looked. One evening, Hank tried to teach Aiko a phrase, "Don't pull the reins, feel the reins." She didn't understand at first. So he demonstrated, closing his eyes, breathing with the horse, letting it sense the motion rather than command it. When she tried, the animal responded, calmer, smoother. She laughed without realizing it. Hank grinned. See? Horse knows heart. It was the first time she heard kindness spoken like a lesson. Rumors of the Pacific Front drifted in through newspapers. The rancher read aloud to his men, Saipan fallen, Tokyo bombed. The women listened in silence, faces unreadable. Their nation was bleeding, yet they stood in a field of abundance, surrounded by food they could touch but not own. That contrast haunted Aiko more than hunger ever had. One afternoon, while moving feed, a Mustang panicked at the crack of thunder. The wagon lurched and Sachiko slipped beneath the wheel. Before anyone could react, Aiko seized the reins, swung herself down, and pulled her friend free. The horse reared wild-eyed. Hank rushed forward, but Aiko was already at its head, murmuring soft, steady words in Japanese. The animal calmed. When it finally lowered its neck, the cowboys stared in disbelief. "She's got the touch," Hank said. "Born rider." The translator repeated it, and Aiko shook her head, breathless. "Not born. Taught." That night, the women laughed around the stove for the first time. The laughter felt dangerous, almost disloyal, yet it spread like heat through the small room. They spoke of how strange the Americans were, how they worked hard but joked harder, how they trusted strangers, how they believed anything could be learned. Sachiko whispered, "Maybe they're not like the stories said." Aiko didn't answer. She was thinking about the horse's calm eyes, the trust it had given her. Days later, another delivery came, crates of vegetables from a nearby farm. The women helped unload them, and Hank handed Aiko a small peach from the crate. She hesitated, then bit into it. The sweetness was unbearable, too pure for wartime. She turned away so he wouldn't see her tears. In late August, a letter arrived at the ranch office, news of heavy Japanese losses, of surrender talk spreading. No one told the women directly, but whispers ran through the Cowboys' camp. Aiko sensed it in the quiet that followed, in Hank's eyes when he said goodnight instead of the usual wave. Something was ending, though no one could yet say what. The next morning, the work continued as if nothing had changed. The Mustangs still needed feeding, fences mending, water fetched. But every movement carried a new weight, the awareness that their time here was temporary, that soon they would return to a homeland that might no longer exist. And yet, as Aiko guided her horse down the path toward the lower fields, she realized that captivity had already become something else entirely. It was no longer about survival. It was about understanding. The ranch had turned into a classroom none of them had asked for, teaching lessons no government could control, dignity without rank, strength without violence, freedom without borders. When the day ended, she dismounted and stood still for a long time, watching the dust settle. She could no longer tell where the ranch ended and the camp began. The fences were there, yes, but they no longer defined her world. That night, she wrote in the back of an old notebook she carried from home. "If war is built on fear, then peace must be built on trust. Today, I learned both can be taught with reins." She closed the notebook, placed it beneath her pillow, and listened to the faint harmonica drifting again through the dark. Somewhere outside, a horse snorted softly, and she smiled to herself. The Americans had stopped calling them prisoners. Now they called them riders. But soon, the world beyond those fences would remind them who they were, and who they had become. September 1945, Galveston Port, Texas. They were going home, though none of them knew what that word meant anymore. The war had ended weeks ago. Japan had surrendered. The women stood on the dock beside the ship that would take them back across the Pacific, their duffel bags packed with government-issued clothes and a few keepsakes the ranch hands had quietly slipped inside, a handkerchief, a small horseshoe charm, a photograph of the group standing by the fence. The Cowboys had come to see them off, hats in hand, faces solemn. No speeches, no music. Just a shared silence too heavy for words. Aiko had imagined this moment for months, freedom, return, closure. But standing there, she realized none of those words fit. She wasn't the same woman who had arrived in Texas in chains of fear. The world she had left behind was gone, replaced by ruins and ration lines. The world she was leaving had shown her something unbearable in its simplicity, kindness without reason. That was harder to accept than cruelty ever was. The journey south from the camp had been quiet. The women rode in the same type of truck that had brought them in a year before. Only now the guards didn't carry rifles. They passed through fields they once worked, the fences shining silver in the sun. When the ranch disappeared behind a hill, no one spoke for hours. It felt like losing a piece of something they hadn't known they'd found. Aiko still carried her small notebook. Inside were words she'd written through those long months, not about the war, but about work, laughter, horses, and the strange patience of American men who never called them enemies. She wanted to burn it before boarding, afraid of what the censors might think, but something stopped her. Those pages were the only proof that captivity hadn't been the whole story. At the port, an officer gave them final papers. "I exchange under Geneva," he said flatly, as if it were just procedure. The women signed with trembling hands. The ocean wind tore at the documents, but they held tight. Freedom was official now, sealed and stamped. Still, it didn't feel like victory. As they waited to embark, Hank appeared from the crowd, the same cowboy who had first taught Aiko to ride. His hair was shorter, his posture awkward without a horse nearby. He looked uncertain, as if unsure whether it was right to speak. Then he stepped forward, holding something small. A strip of leather, braided neatly, the kind used as a rein grip. "Thought you might want this," he said. The translator wasn't there anymore, so Aiko caught only fragments of meaning. But she understood the gesture. She bowed slightly, pressing the leather to her chest. "Thank you," she said in careful English. "For everything." He smiled, eyes soft. "You rode good. Don't forget." Then he turned and left, walking back toward the line of trucks without looking back. That was the last American face she saw before boarding. The ship's engines rumbled low and steady. The women stood on deck as the Texas coastline shrank into a thin brown line. The wind carried the smell of salt and fuel, but Aiko's mind was still on the ranch, on the way the Cowboys had trusted them to work beside them, on how the Mustangs had responded to their voices, on the quiet dignity of shared labor. She wondered if those men realized what they had done, that they had given lessons no sermon could teach. In Japan, the docks of Yokohama were unrecognizable. Smoke still lingered over half-burned buildings. The women were processed by military clerks who didn't look them in the eye. To the officials, they were symbols of defeat, reminders of failure. Aiko tried to tell one officer that she had worked on a ranch in Texas, that she had learned to ride. He looked at her as if she were delirious. "You were a prisoner," he said coldly. "I do not forget that." She didn't answer. But she did not forget either. Only not in the way he meant. Weeks passed before she found her family, fragments of a home, faces older, thinner, haunted. They wanted to know how the Americans had treated her. She hesitated. "How do you explain gentleness to people who had only known fire?" "They worked us," she said finally. "But not with cruelty. They taught us things." Her brother frowned. "Taught?" She nodded. Yes. Horses. Work. Laughter." He didn't understand. Few would. At night, she opened her notebook and reread the lines she had written under the Texas sky. "If war is built on fear, then peace must be built on trust." The words felt dangerous now, too generous to say aloud in a country still nursing its pride. But they were true, and she carried them like a hidden prayer. Months later, she took a job at a small clinic outside Tokyo. The nation was rebuilding, brick by brick, wound by wound. One morning, a farmer arrived with a horse injured by shrapnel left in a field. The animal panicked when approached. No one could calm it until Aiko stepped forward, moving slowly, breathing with the same rhythm she'd learned in Texas. The horse steadied. The farmer stared. "You've done this before," he said. She smiled faintly. "Once, long ago, in another life." That night, she walked home beneath a sky as wide as she could remember it, though the land was crowded now with ruins and shadows. Freedom, she realized, wasn't a place or a flag. It was a way of standing in the world without fear. The Americans had given her that lesson, not through words but through work, through the simple decency of men who believed skill mattered more than hatred. Years passed. Letters from America arrived occasionally through Red Cross channels. One was from the rancher's wife, a photograph of the barn rebuilt, a note in careful handwriting. The Mustangs are still wild. Hank says you'd still outried him. Aiko kept it pressed inside her notebook until the pages yellowed. By the time her hair turned gray, the war had become history. But memory never obeys history. It returns in fragments, the sound of rains tightening, the smell of dust after rain, the strange tenderness in a foreign tongue. When people asked about her captivity, she always said the same thing: I was a prisoner, yes. But I was taught freedom there. Once, on the anniversary of her return, she took a train to the countryside where a small riding school had opened under American occupation programs. The horses were smaller than the Texas Mustangs, but when she placed her hand on one's neck, the same calm strength pulsed beneath her palm. She closed her eyes and whispered in English, "A horse knows heart." A tear slid down her cheek, though she was smiling. She remembered Hank's words, the laughter, the long Texas afternoons when captivity had turned into something almost sacred, an understanding of dignity that no nation could dictate. In her final notebook entry, she wrote, "I left Japan once as a prisoner of war. I returned as a student of humanity. The land of my captors taught me to ride without fear, and in that rhythm, I learned the quiet shape of freedom." She never saw Texas again. But somewhere, she knew, the Mustangs still ran, and the wind still carried the same truth. She had once lived among strangers who called her by a name she hadn't known she needed. Rider. They had come as enemies. They had left as witnesses. And in that silent exchange between horse, human, and horizon, they found the one victory the war could never erase: understanding.